Okay, welcome to Alta Mesa Center for the Arts November reading series. We're thrilled today to host Juliet Patterson and Tobey Hiller. And there they are. Alta Mesa Center for the Arts is an interfaith arts and spirituality hub housed within and sponsored by Orinda Community Church. We believe that art is a spiritual act and a human right. We wish to provide a place where people from diverse traditions, artistic practices, and economic realities come together in community. We know that art can bridge the divisions, the substantive and the arbitrary that divide us. We come together not only to practice and teach the arts, but to celebrate and learn from our differences and to foster lively and respectful interdisciplinary dialogues. We seek unity in diversity. And wherever you are on your artistic and your spiritual journey, whoever you are welcome here. Tobey Hiller writes poetry, fiction, and flash. Her publications include 4 books of poetry, Crossing, Certain Weathers, Aqueduct, and Crow Mind from Finishing Line Press most recently, and a novel, Charlie's Exit, from Edgewood's Books. She's published individual stories and flash, writings on literature and psychology, and a book of surreal, fabulous stories called Flight of the Fabulary from Unlikely Books, which was a finalist for Omnidon's Fabulous Collection Contest. She recently completed a new poetry collection and is at work on a book of realist short stories. Juliet Patterson is the author of Sinkhole, A Legacy of Suicide from Milkweed Editions, which was a finalist for the 2023 Minnesota Book Awards and named one of the best memoirs of 2022 by Library Journal. She has published 2 full-length poetry collections, Affinity, a finalist for the 2017 Audre Lorde Poetry Award, and The Truant Lover from Night Books in 2006, which was the winner of the Night Boat Poetry Prize and a finalist for the 2006 Lambda Literary Award. She teaches creative writing and literature at St. Olaf College and is also a faculty member and director of the college's Environmental Conversations program. And both of these authors write poetry and prose. They each seek understanding beyond the human realms for impossible questions about what it means to be sentient, to be alive, and about how someone might take their own life. And to do so, it's not just words they search for, but the right form through which to examine and unfold experience that make mockery of our everyday modes of expression. With their remarkable books, they seek, as Carl Phillips writes in My Trade is Mystery, the right tool for the job. Epic accommodates story better than sonnet does, he says. The way a sail is preferable to a net for catching the wind. So today we're going to look at 2 very different stories and 2 very remarkable writers who are each trying to find the right mode to catch these impossible subjects. We're going to start with Tobey, and she's going to read for a bit. We'll switch to Juliet, and then we'll open up to conversation. If you have anything you want to mention in the chat, please do. We'll answer questions at the end. And I hope you enjoy this talk as much as I enjoyed reading these books. Tobey.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Alta Mesa Center for the Arts, and thank you, Juliet. I'm very happy to be here, and I think it's going to be very interesting and fun too, despite the sorrow and grief of some of the subjects. So I'm going to start by reading. I am hoping to read mostly poetry, but also a little bit of prose. And I'm sure that we will talk a little bit about why one and why the other. But I think what I want to say about the first, I'm going to read from Crow Mind, which is my latest book of poems. And I think what I want to say about that first, before I read, is simply that there was a summer in which I began to feed a lot of crows on my, and well, not a lot. The first group were a family, and they quickly developed a relationship with me, and I'm very interested in the relationships between our animal species and other animals, and even the other organic substances in the world. And so, and inorganic also, rock, earth, everything that exists is there for us to look at and be sentient about. So these poems flew in sort of like a cluster or a tribe. It's the only experience I've had like that. Usually I write poems, when they come every once in a while. These poems came in a flock and very quickly. And I'm going to read, so I'm going to read from them first. The first one I'll read is called Luster. If I can find it. Here, let me just look in the Luster. Crow shines as the darkest star. Light burrows into the coal of him, blacks down to diamond, bounces off his sharp facets into midnight's noon. It is his cloak and dagger. He wears it on his shoulders the way Mercury wore flight and cunning, armor, trumpet, name of what black is underneath the sun. Luster's reason is without preamble. The first cause is always light. The second poem, there's a lot of observation involved if you're interested in the world. The second poem is called Their Drinking. Drinking, they stretch ink black slink throats back, tip beaks high to sky, like any bantam, any songbird, any egret, turkey, pheasant, jay, as all their broad nation does. Except the hummingbird, whose acrobatic helicopter sip with that anteater tongue is a legend in all backyards and spider sagas. Crow doesn't tell that story. It's his own, he knows by heart. Story is also part of what keeps coming into my work, even when I'm writing poems. So, we all tell stories. That's kind of what human beings do for a living. Of course, while I was watching these crows, I became very interested. I had been interested in corvids already, and I had done a lot of research already, and I started to do more. So this is called I Read, He Plays. While Crow, or some relative, slides down windshields and roads and hills in the snow, or bites some unsuspecting dog's tail in the park, or chases cats around a courtyard and waddles off, all a cackle, I watch him online, researching the habits of his kind. The way he figures me out is just what I did when I was small. He watches, crows look, notice pattern, think today is, tomorrow will be, and then crow tests it. I know this because crows out there watching me, watching. When I was young, I slid down snowbanks too. Slippery's its own reward. Crow knows we're dangerous, and not sometimes. He recognizes faces, counts enemy and friend. If Crow were larger than me, I'd watch him like that too. This one is called Last Year's Sorrow. Last year's sorrow, was it theirs? Last year I found a crow baby, desiccate, half buried in grass, hard by the back garden gate, head thrown impossibly back, wings hardly pinioned. Was it theirs? Crows mate for life, and crow babies grow up slow. For 3 or 4 years, they teenage between Zoom and Fortune, play fake doom and boom before they settle down to all that family labor. This year, did they send their babies successful into sky? An ancestor of mine, Zilpah Hall, married at 24 in 1804, bore 9 children. Ardelia, Lydia, Alonzo, Ruth, Abigail, Sarah, Rowena, Mary, Fanny. She was always pregnant, bearing, suckling. Alonzo, the boy, died at just over 1 year. I know this, though not how Zilpah wept, binding up her sorrow in silence, bent over the washtub, tears dripping into laundry. I know this because his sister Rowena made a sampler listing her family's names and their dates. At the bottom is a prayer for Alonzo. This is my prayer for the crow baby, dead before he fledged, and for his siblings who fly now and argue and bathe and watch me for the hope I bring as water. One of the things that I thought a lot about when I was writing these crow poems is how crows are very like us. They're extremely successful. They fill every niche. They push out other birds. They are very smart. They are also deceitful. They mate for life, but they aren't faithful to their mates. They are liminal in the way that we are liminal. They learn how to live with other animals and species very, very well, although they're hard on them, just as we are. So this poem is called How Crow Became Legion. How Crow Became Legion's a saga of many stanzas with long slogs between boughs of the slow millennia and sky to tell it to. His tribe likes congregation, finds ways to gather plain-wise and catch as catch canny, sweeps a wide soar from belt to forest, down to meadow and up to sky, gypsy bursts of clatterblack, minor thieveries, and rumors of war till the river's owned. Behind the garbage dump will do just fine, string and bottles, just 2 of what is underfoot. 4 and 20 will burst out of any pie. He calls it Saga of the Noonday Raven, blackest epic of them all. His eyes worldwide, his heart's as red and pulsing with all the heart's 4 and 20 chariots of desire as yours and mine. Come, brother, come, sister, he says. I will show you how to grow and grow. And the last one is about the many myths and stories that crow and other corvids too, particularly raven, have inhabited. Many First Nations and many cultures have had stories and myths about the crow and the raven in particular, and some of them are about their dark qualities, and some of them are about their cleverness. And I just want to tell a little story about ravens. Ravens have been known to fly upside down for half a mile because it's fun. I mean, maybe that's not why, but why else would they do it? You know, and crows and ravens both, you know, slide down windshields on snow and do loop-de-loops in the sky. So another thing they share with us is play. This is called The Sun Burglar. This is a Native American story. The Brothers of Sleeplessness, Hook, Houdini. Crow has always known how to tell a story, how to burgle Sky Chief, become his daughter's fussy child, fly like a plucked black hair through the smoke hole, and seed the unlit sky with stars and moon. How to tell Odin what to think, that would be Hugin, and what to remember, Munin, after the pair circle the whole world while the hammer thrower sleeps. First Nations know he can carve a canoe that will grow a foot to walk right out of drowning waters, survive the scheming uncle, talk dirty to Perdella's kicking foot, and clothed in his cloak of trickeries all the way through any history's epic, transform your car into a nutcracker. Researchers watch crows solve it. Use rocks to weight a board till it slants to drop the needed stick, displace water in a beaker with 1 stone, 2, 3, till what he wants floats within reach. Bend a hook and using it with string, lift food out of a tube, or in the wild, dig a morsel out of a tree with a forked stick, poke it out of an anthill, or pretend to stash it while another bird watches, because thievery's eye comes easily to him. Shaman, trickster, quick study, Mr. Black-eyed, sleek of smarts, still transforms the world we like to call our own. That's about the crow, and then I'm going to read a few later newer poems from my current manuscript, which is called Before Anything is Dust. And then if there's time, I will read a very short flash piece. But Mary, I did time all this, but Mary, if I'm going over, just let me know, okay? So these poems, as I say, are later poems, most of them. All of these poems, many of these poems in the manuscript have appeared someplace or other. This one is called Say I Made This Up, and it refers both to the inner world and to physics, the invisible stuff, the small stuff and the large stuff that we live with. Say I made this up. At the center is a stillness where no word or apple falls, a garden whose walls are wind hardened to the speed of light. Here everything's invisible, our lives, dawn, the few certainties such as death. It is not a river, it is wind. It is not a particle, it blows. It is not wind, but light, nor light. It is a river, falls inward into everywhere, not river and wind, nor light and into word, a still word. Say this is just the mind stitching an illusion regarding place, because going in creates an entrance, because going in, no maps at hand, no single path, no pole star, a certain darkness, largeness. Say it's a story or a hope, 2 different things. Say it's an edge dream. Say anything. The dust of it smells red. The next one is called, for instance, The Layer of Heat. She believed in explanations. Much later, she told herself the unexpected was every day. For instance, the gliding motion of love becomes a grinding, shears something off. For instance, the layer of heat below the steady seeming ground surges up sudden, fires flesh, bucking red past Earth's backbone, causing new islands, archipelagos, green and windy, rock-ridden. And love's geology. Flames travel, hardens into nows, shine, and rough. For instance, sometimes she counts it simple, warmth's welcome when the night is cold, or morning stillness chills. She tells herself the story of what was with the jacket of later laid on, an iridescence, friable as a dragonfly's wing. Time and weather carve the landscape. What rises next? I say the future's imperative, a braille of solids melting. Who can explain the everyday? Forgive flame, forgive what hardens, clasp it, still she hopes. This next one is a prose poem. It's called As for the Worm. As for the worm, it inches. The orangutan, on the other hand, scratches, thinking of a joke involving a burlap bag, the people watching him, and his own head. But not only the snake slithers. The press conference will be at 10 a.m. Words fill the air like crows looking for the nearest edible morsel, or gnats seeking out the liquid refreshment of a deer's eyes. I mean, it's words. Is that nature? We're better than the other animals at it. Wolf, wolf, the story goes, and then stockpiled guns in the garage. In the slam pong blare of question and answer, you can hear a low, dangerous buzz, electric as the crackle of insects frying against a light bulb. Next is a silence in which water boils. It is a moment of urgency for the water, as the poet says. Love, too, commits cliff. War, nothing stops, only changes shape, velocity, or trajectory. From point to cluster, from liquid to ice, from possible to bomb, from perhaps to hope. Requires air. These possibles fly everywhere, of all stripes and fancies. The long march toward the mountains you are dreaming of, or the place you never wanted to go, has already begun. There are two more from this section of poems. This is called We. We are a message in a bottle, a handprint smeared in ochre, or blood on asphalt, hope of some god who forgot his name. Map to a hidden treasure, can you believe it? We are a wolverine, a snake, a wolf, a hummingbird, a dead whale, and possibly ambergris. If we are a song you almost remember, it might be better to forget. The dictionary says you can't spell us. Grammar's always a problem. Numbers too. How many lives for a bale of cotton? We have no wings. Claw on a galactic lion. Sand's wet slide back into before. We like to swallow yesterday. Time is a transitive verb. Or a railroad, speed bullet. We might be rain in another country if we can do it. And this last one, which is the anchor poem of the new collection, is called The Closing of the South Park Road. Where I live in Tilden Park, they close a road every year because there are newts that come from Mount Diablo to cover, to migrate basically across the road into a place they want to go. The closing of the South Park Road happens every year, just when the light grows lucid, forgiving nothing and disappearing into beauty, as Emily says. On these fall days, the air over the water opens into a hard, wise body, lying low and immortal over everything it loves. And during this particular light, and clocked by leaves darking into mold, the brown newts that live in the park and on Mount Diablo appear in droves, emerging from any under, all shining and sheeny and lacking in corners, as though made from foam spawn or grown secret as mushrooms in some place wet and between we'd never imagined, right there in our own backyards. We think of the South Park Road as ours. After all, we built it, but they cross it as though it's theirs, clogging its black with their brown, insisting bodies, slicking it with newt travel, faster than snails, leaving no trail, but something more like water than our flesh is. They cannot get enough of whatever it is they're after, each other, or life, or coupling, or the deepness of a brown and shining place, the egg place, the smelly meat sweet of mold, those little toes, articulate and too easily smashed. So now, this time of year, they close the road. Before anything is dust, it lies low and immortal in desire's long body, with light riding on its back, and disappears.
Those were wonderful. Thank you, Tobey.
Thank you. Thank you. If I take it, I probably don't have time to read the little prose piece.
Probably not. Maybe at the end we'll circle back because we
Fine.
still have this question
That's
of different
great.
forms too. Thank you. And everyone can give their give their virtual or real response online. And now Juliet, you are mostly working in poems before this latest book. I will let you describe the why of that and why this subject demanded the form that it took.
Sure. Yeah. Some of this may come up in our conversation after I read a little bit, but I'm electing to read from this memoir, which I published about a year ago, and it's called Sinkhole, Legacy of Suicide. I've been working on this book for 10 years, and I guess I would describe myself as a rather single-minded writer. I don't have multiple projects going on at one time. And when I was writing poetry, I would sort of work on one poem at a time until it was finished. So when I started this project, I didn't realize it was a book for many years, couple of years. I was in the process of grieving my father, who died by suicide in 2009. And because I'm a writer, I started writing to kind of understand my own emotions. But I also have two grandfathers that died by suicide on both sides of my family. And neither of those men were discussed much in my family by my parents. It's when my father died, this door kind of swung open, and I felt like I needed to go back to find out more about these men. Both sides of my family, 3 generations, come from a small town in southeastern Kansas, 30 miles north of the Oklahoma border, so just on the Ozark Plateau. And one side of my family was coal miners. And this area where they came from in the turn of the century, the 19th century, was a huge coal mining region, which I knew very little about. So what happened in the process of grieving my father is I ended up going back to this little town to just research my family. So again, I had no idea I was writing a book, but I was journaling faithfully, sort of my raw emotions about grief. And at the same time, I was performing research that I thought was just for myself. So I was writing based on research, and then also keeping this, what I would call a journal. About 2 years into this method, I went to Pittsburgh and discovered right across the street from my grandmother's house. I went to visit her house spontaneously, and there was a giant sinkhole, and a house had been lifted up off its foundation. And I stood in front of that sinkhole and felt like I had been delivered a metaphor in the physical realm. And as a poet, I felt like the metaphor was the way into what I then perceived as a creative project. So by that point, I had a lot of writing. None of it was in poetic form. And I just proceeded along with a kind of an attempt to write prose, but it was very hard one. And we can talk more about that later. I'm going to just read 3 short excerpts, and I hope, so I'm jumping around the book, I hope it makes some sense. There's a lot of themes in this book, a lot of threads. Suicide is one of them, and I'm sort of investigating not only the sort of study of suicide, but just sort of the phenomenon of suicide and why it happens, and trying to obviously get inside my own father's mind, but also the men that I didn't know. But once I got to Pittsburgh, I got very deeply involved in this place. And I can see now that it was in some ways sort of a repository for my grief. But the place, because of its history and its particular history with coal mining and extractive practices, also became kind of a metaphor for, I think, our sort of large planetary kind of suicide that we're kind of committing. And so that's a thread. And then also, of course, the people. You won't hear about my grandfathers, but I'm going to read a little short piece about my father, a little bit about Pittsburgh, and I'll just open with kind of a gesture towards his death. Bridges surround me. About 40 of them cross the Mississippi within the boundaries of Minneapolis and St. Paul. I live on the west bank of the river, within walking distance of 4, a railroad bridge, a double-decked beam bridge, where the poet John Berryman jumped to his death in 1972, a concrete arch bridge bearing a freeway, and finally, the I-35 box girder bridge that replaced the steel truss arch bridge that collapsed in 2007, toppling 108 feet into the river and riverbanks. If I leave my house for a walk, which I often do, I can find a bridge in nearly every direction. Bridge number 62075, as registered in the Ramsey County record, was built in 1927 and adorned with Art Deco features, a sprawling arch suspended by massive footings and grates. It's a majestic but unassuming structure and doesn't cross water. For this reason, it's perhaps an unlikely suicide site. Bridges are rarely used in suicide hangings. Trees are more common, though more often yet people hang themselves in their homes, attic, basement, garage, patio. So what brought my father to the bridge? It is roughly 1 mile from my parents' house. In his younger years, my father routinely ran their dogs in the nearby park. He also used to exercise frequently by climbing the steps that wound up and around the bridge's piers. He knew the bridge and its terrain well. It's easy to see how it might have occupied his imagination. And in choosing a public space, he might have been thinking of my mother, perhaps sparing her the trauma of discovering the body, or he might have thought he was less likely to be interrupted outside the house. And why hanging? It's accessible, quick, simple, yet highly effective. My mother and I arrived in Pittsburgh 8 days before my father's memorial service. 6 months had passed since his death. Minnesota's winter had finally come to an end. The clear roads and soft ground we had been waiting for had arrived. Pittsburgh is a small town that sits on the edge of the Ozark Mountains, a mix of forest and prairie characterized by deep, fertile soils and red clay. It's a uniquely abundant environment, and it is that abundance that granted the town what significance or prosperity it ever enjoyed, specifically via the coal mining industry. This began in a small way in the 1850s when coal was hauled by wagon to Granby, Missouri, where it was used by blacksmiths. The first underground shaft in the region was sunk in 1874. By 1898, 30 mines were operating within 5 miles of Pittsburgh, 17 within 2.5 miles of town. Broadway Street is still the main road through town today, as it was back then, a muddy dirt road with wooden sidewalks and hitching posts. And now it's a sprawling, empty thoroughfare that shifts into a highway boasting signs of modern development, industrial-sized streetlights, strip malls, fast food restaurants, and hotels. Walmart, the Home Depot, and Starbucks gutter the north side. This is the first thing you see when you drive into town, a plateau of asphalt and parking lots. It's a town of commerce. It's a town of work. What I knew of Pittsburgh existed in fragments. I had impressionistic memories, stilled images, waxed and faded, bits of rock and clay, the perfumed bathroom of my grandmother's house, and the fragrance of magnolias wafting through the air. But I knew little of its history or how it might have shaped my ancestral stock. My parents left Pittsburgh after they were married in the late 1950s and moved to upstate New York after settling in Minnesota. They never talked about why they left. They were the only members of their generations on both sides to leave Kansas behind. Some relatives, particularly my maternal grandmother, seemed to not only disapprove their decision to leave Pittsburgh, but to view the choice as a personal affront. And so over the years, my parents' visits would become more and more infrequent. Even as a child, I understood the journey as psychologically taxing, and I could recognize the complicated emotions aroused in sudden outbursts and arguments. On all our visits there, my father's mood was notably volatile, his body language tense. I can still see him in the front seat of the car, clenching his teeth, the muscles at the back of his jaw throbbing in the highway's glare as my mother sat quietly in the passenger seat. It was a goodly land, fair to look upon and full of promise, Nathaniel Allison wrote in his 1904 History of Cherokee County, Kansas, and Representative Citizens. Now most of the trees are gone, stripped for the bounty of minerals beneath. Where the land has been remediated, much of the terrain resembles a vacant prairie, a shell of what it used to be. And where it hasn't, less than a 30-minute drive from Pittsburgh, it's a waste dump of lead-tinged dust, contaminated soil, and sinkholes. At the cemetery, the caretaker emerged from his office and greeted us on the lawn. We followed him back inside. There, he carefully followed my father's plot, marked my father's plot on a map with an oil crayon. A red line rippled through my last name, a pointed visual representation of my patriarchal lineage. Men had been scarce in my family, and now they were all gone. I know my father is dead, but I don't always remember. Sometimes darkness pulls and my mind falls blank. Sometimes his voice calls from somewhere in the future or from deep in the past. Sometimes from somewhere I can't identify. A few months after he died, I started dreaming of him all the time. One night, my father laughing. I just can't remember him as happy, I said to Rachel in the morning. Well, he always seemed happy to see you. Really? That's the trouble with suicide, she said. It eclipses everything. These dreams ushered in memories, other illusory glimpses that arrived in daytime. My father at the kitchen sink, drinking lemonade from a jar or skimming bread with fat pieces of butter. The faint odor of clove shampoo he frequently used, how he held a spoon low on the handle near to the dome, how he held his razor the same way, fingers wrapped at the base of its head, chin tilting toward the bathroom mirror, a towel draped around his neck, how he organized and arranged things with fastidious care, his desk, his closet, his drawers, how he was always impeccably groomed, his unwavering wardrobe. In his working years, he wore a suit. Later on, he wore Henley shirts and khakis. He never wore shorts unless playing tennis. He never wore bright colors or patterns. His shirts were solid navy, white, or black. He often wore a baseball hat, absent of logos. He did have a Baltimore Orioles hat, not because he liked the team, but because he liked the bird. And he favored lug-sole boots all year long, even in summer. The cassette tapes I found in his car, John Adams, Tom Waits, all kinds of country music. When I was a child, he liked to play Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass album, Whipped Cream and Other Delights. or at my mother's request, the Moody Blues' Days of Future Past. That was the decade of the Beatles. We didn't have their music in the house, nor that of the Rolling Stones, Bob Marley, or Jimi Hendrix. In many ways, my parents were musically out of fashion. This might have later proven a huge disadvantage for me, except that my father made up for the gaps. He regularly brought singles of my favorite radio hits, Good Vibrations, Joy to the World, and To Serve with Love, which meant that he'd been paying attention to what I loved. We listened to the radio most often in the car, though sometimes I was allowed to tune the living room's transistor and spin the volume high. The most important single I remember was Van Morrison's 1967 Brown Eyed Girl, which my father miraculously pulled from an elastic pocket inside his briefcase one night after dinner. I watched the record emerge from its white sleeve, the black vinyl glossed in light. The turntable started to spin, the record and the needle both dropped, and then we started to dance. My father wasn't a good singer, and he rarely let it rip, but Brown Eyed Girl made magic with him. Do you remember when we used to sing sha la 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 ti da? The song became an anthem we shared. Soon my father had a pet nickname for me, Brown-Eyed Bug. In future renderings, he took the liberty of altering Van Morrison's lyrics. Even now, whenever I hear the song, these are the words I hear. Thank you.
I'm glad that you read that part. It made me cry with love for him and for you when I'd read it the first time, and it has nearly done it again. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
You can find both books in the chat. I put links to both of them there. And I have lots of questions, but if there's one that's posed in the chat, I'll step down and let the voices come out. And if you're still thinking, I'll go ahead and ask a question to get us going. And one of the things that we had been talking about, one of the pleasures of this job is that we get to meet and talk about books behind all of your backs before we appear here on Sunday. And one of the themes that we were considering is the interconnectedness of all things, and the maybe not the recent insanity of the human mind that suggests that we are separate, apart, above the very lands and animals and beings of which we are part. Can you speak, both of you, about how your work, Juliet, both your work as a writer, but also the institute that you run, and Tobey, most everything I've read of yours speaks to that notion of interconnectedness?
Juliet.
Well, I think, I mean, I think that I've always felt connected, as Tobey was intimating in her introduction, to creatures and species and non-animate objects in the natural world. But what I would say is, working on this project, it became very clear to me, if I hadn't known it already, that we are deeply connected to sort of the tragedy of what we've done to those things, but also, of course, the beauty. So I think a lot about what feminist scholar Donna Haraway talks about, the Sulithine, she calls it, and I think she actually says that our only way out of the mess we're in, politically, spiritually, and environmentally, is to sort of dwell in the interconnectedness. I live in a city, and so I'm still puzzling over, how to do that well. I struggle particularly with other humans in the city. And then it's hard to know how to do that with the modern world, right? With all the information that we're ingesting, the images that we see, the wars that we encounter. I mean, I've been really sort of racked with grief this last few weeks around the war in Palestine and Gaza. And it's very hard for me to know how to be present and still hold those feelings, present with what's in my immediate sphere and still hold those feelings. I don't know if that answered your question, but the interconnectedness is very profound because of our modern condition. So there's a more simple version, but I think we're now challenged to think about it in a very complex way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would definitely agree. I think part of interconnectedness is body-based, is part of our skin connection to the world, to other people, to the organic and inorganic world is part of what makes us feel, if we're observant, the connectedness we have with our environment. And so I wasn't really thinking about this, but the introduction that you made to our worldwide connections now, and the news that flows in immediately everywhere, and the media that we use, that kind of connection is somewhat overwhelming to us, and I think may actually blur in some ways our ability to be alive to the connectedness we feel, and it engenders incredible grief. It does. I mean, one of the poems I was going to read but didn't read is called Fortune's Wall, and it's about the images of people falling out of the sky in the middle distance, because all the time we are aware now of that, and people have been, even when they didn't have this worldwide media to remind us. So kind of what I want to say is that suffering is a part of the interconnectedness that we feel, and that the immediate connection with animals, other animals, it is one of the ways that even as children we take that in. If you see roadkill, for instance, as a child, or you have you live among animals, or you have a pet that dies, most children can take in that is somehow a part of themselves, that is experiencing that suffering. So I do think that the only way forward in the climate crisis we're in the environmental crisis we're in, as well as in the political and I do want to say something about lies and stories here, as well as in the political situation, is for us to find ways, and art is central to that because of its spiritual connection to the connectedness, to find ways to be alive to the connections of everything, but not to be overwhelmed by the helplessness of it. And that's a very difficult balance to strike now. I wanted to, yeah, go.
I was going to say, you're making me think of the word intimacy, not interconnectedness, but the cost and the rewards of real intimacy, which I think a lot of us, except on very narrow realms, allow ourselves to experience. I don't know exactly why that word is coming to mind, but Juliet, is there something in your response to your father's loss, especially in that last section that you'd read? There was such intimacy in that section, and the loss and the love comes both in that same experience of reading that for me.
Are you asking if I felt intimacy or?
Well, I'm assuming you would, but I'm wondering really
Yeah.
about the notion of intimacy and if it's part of our the cost of interconnection is intimacy, which we both crave and fear very much.
Yeah, I think maybe. And I think maybe this doesn't tie into what we're talking about, but I think something that I'm still thinking about, just having worked on this book for so long, is the process of grief, and grief is very individual, so this is complicated, but I wonder very much about spaces for communal grief.
Mm.
I found very few, and just sort of the things we're talking about, when we have larger existential concerns that I think we're all grieving. And so I feel like Western culture especially is very good at pushing grief aside, or we're uncomfortable with it. And I guess I feel determined, as part of my work around intimacy, is to really find ways to be creative with grief. So not just be in the sorrowful state, but to find space around collective grieving.
A few weeks ago, we were talking about lamentations in church, and a side conversation randomly had with someone else. She was saying, well, why don't we praise all the time? But I think church is a place where we can leave space for real collective lamentations and help people together work through what we can't even conceive of, the losses we can't even conceive of at the moment.
Yes. And I think that is what art does too, right? I think a lot of the art that I resonate with holds both of those feelings at once.
Yeah.
That's sort of the joy and the lamentation.
Right. Tobey, in your book, the Fabulary, what's the part of the first title? I'm forgetting the first.
It's called Flight Advice, a
Flight
Fabulary.
Advice.
Yeah.
You spoke about the mode that story can hold that poems couldn't, that there was almost a character within the first part of that book that was speaking as story to us. That it's
the first yeah.
And it felt like, I've been used to characters speaking to me, but I wasn't used to story speaking to me. And I found it quite an intimate and moving experience to have story, who I feel indebted to, beholden to. But I hadn't really thought of it as an entity, much like a crow might be. But why not? Maybe my conception of what is a being is completely limited.
Wow, that's a complicated question. The first little piece in Flight Advice, which is this book, which I'm very fond of, this little book, is from the point of view of story, who, story is very, very old. As I think I might have said, story is kind of what we do for a living, and story is both what makes us joyous and what creates problems. Stories and lies are very close together. They're side by side, perhaps stepsisters. And to back up a little, when I was young, I read a lot of myths and folk tales and fairy tales. And so it seemed to me the classic thing that the truth in them is not in the detail, but is in what it gives you about the sacred or good and evil, or the truth of relationship, or something like that. But as story makers, we tell stories all the time. That's what people do. They tell stories to themselves about what has happened. They tell stories to each other. We are now in a situation where, and we always have been actually, politicians tell stories about what is happening, and the stories are often lies. Okay, so how do you tell a story that is telling you the truth from a story that is a fabrication that manipulates you, if you're listening closely to it, which happens to children all the time? into believing or not believing or hearing or not hearing. For instance, Juliet's work, the lack of story about her father and her grandfathers, and the clues that made her try to think about or not think about, what the real story was, and then finally to investigate it. It's just such a powerful drive in us to first find a narrative. I mean, that's all about what history is, and then find, if we can, the truth in it, or what the legs of truth are in it, right? And if you write fiction, you're trying to tell the truth about something by making a story that is not perhaps realistic. Like, I'm writing a lot of transformative stories now about half animal, half people. And, I haven't ever actually met, a mermaid or a woman who turned into a tree or something. But there's real truth in these hybrid combinations. So I think a lot about, people give me I'm almost through here, but people give me the standard answer when I say, what is the difference between a story and a lie? People always say, well, a story has truth in it and a lie is deceiving you. But that's not good enough. It's complicated. It's very complicated. And actually, I believe all the animals have stories, narratives too.
I'm putting a PDF, and anybody who cares, for a Le Guin essay called "Why Are Americans Afraid of Dragons?" And in it, she's talking she's getting at something about what you're talking about, how that the truth of a story does not lie in its veracity or its reality.
Oh.
And also in the intent, the writer's intent, and in the reader's and the receiver's ability to know what they're hearing. I think learning to read, a lot of my students are now not reading very well. They're not understanding subtext or irony, or because they just haven't been exposed to story. They've been exposed to lines and fragments and sound bites, but those things put together in a long prose piece can reveal themselves. A writer reveals themselves, whether you like it or not.
Right.
Any other questions in the room? We're at 5, but we can go over. I'm happy if you're happy. We won't go too much over 5:10 for our readers. Health and safety.
I have
Lisa.
one. Yeah, and I think what you were just, what the whole talk about, truth versus not truth, just kind of, emphasizes the problem we have with this kind of really sloppy taxonomy, because we have these separations about genre, and then we have these separations in human knowledge, and these don't all map to each other. My curiosity here is, because we have 2 writers who are so adept in prose and poetry, I'm just curious as to if either of you find yourself gravitating toward knowing that one genre or the other is where you tend to find certain things out more than you find other things out, and if you find yourself, gravitating that way for the different things that you're examining.
That's very interesting. I think I gravitate toward poetry as a spiritual act. There's something about poetry that is, for me, the motion toward actually bridging the gap between myself and the world, whether the world is, my children I'm writing about, or a tree, or, some way that is not, as I don't really know how to say this, but some way that is not, that is an effort, a spiritual effort of devotion in some kind of way. And so the truth is in the desire to connect, although one never quite manages it somehow, which is quite different. The motion for me toward prose does have to do with an impulse toward a story, toward a shape that makes, perhaps not a beginning, middle, and end, but a something that carries you from one little spot to another island, I guess. Not to say a poem doesn't do that, so I don't think I've given a very good explanation, but there you go.
You did. It sounds like one of dynamics. Thank you. Julie?
Time and the conception of time. Yeah. Juliet.
Yeah, I would probably answer very similarly, except to say that I, as a poet, I did not come from storytellers, and I was very skeptical of story for much of my life. And so I think poetry for me was and still is a place that's, I don't want to say anti-story, but it's not interested in narrative. It's interested in, what interests me about poetry is its ability to try to capture emotions in language, right? Which is an impossibility. But it is something about the musicality of words and language and the attention of silence inside a poem that I don't think plays out the same way in a narrative. And when I switched to writing prose, it was very, very hard for me. I did not understand how to construct a narrative, and I cheated my way through it. I really just constructed the narrative out of creating a lot of small parts that I thought of as kind of poems. But in the process of writing, and as Tobey intimated, just by unearthing my ancestral story, I really am different as a thinker and writer now when it comes to story. I think story is really, really essential. But I don't know what that means for me as a poet anymore.
They both require a great deal of omission. And the poem and Juliet, having done all this research, how much you had to leave out in order to allow story primacy in the manuscript.
Yeah, that's very interesting what both of you have said. I think I agree with Juliet that that language is somewhat different in prose and in poetry, but since Virginia Woolf was one of my early favorites, there is no doubt that what she writes in prose is as rich and poetically, solid as any poet's work. I think what it is about poems, as Juliet said, is silence. There is space in poems. And I don't particularly like or there are a lot of narrative poets, but I don't particularly, I'm not drawn to narrative poetry either. But an absence of narrative in one's life, or a narrative that one sinks into too deeply, those are life-changing and sometimes dangerous, either one of them, in different ways. I mean, so narratives is just yeah. It's like something though is very compelling to me about narrative too.
What do you think, Julia?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, I don't know how to put this. I think there's a subtle difference for me about the mind and how the mind is expressed. So I'm again a poet who likes to read people who are emoting and also have an intellectual engagement on the page. And the poetry, I'm paraphrasing William Carlos Williams, I think, who was interested in trying to replicate consciousness through the mechanism of the poem. And to me, I get closer to that than I do in anything I do in prose. But
Mhm.
So it's something about the mind of the narrative starts to feel far more constructed than it does in poems, even though poems are also constructed.
Now we could
We could go
we
on.
could go
Yeah,
on.
I really-
That was very abstract.
That's an astute, no, that's a very astute comment, Juliet, because there is a way in which poems attempt to express thought and feeling, that the way they're all tangled up, you know, the way they the way they come together and part, and that's true. Yeah.
But you're this subject, it's very dear and difficult subject, came in this form rather than the one that you had known.
Yes.
I don't know if there's a question there, just an observation that you had to change completely your mode of thinking in order to even consider the subject.
Yeah. And I mean, as I expressed, I was, journaling, and that was a very raw kind of stream of consciousness. I remember in that early period, and I started writing like the day my father died, and and really didn't stop. I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to try and write a poem, and I just couldn't do it. I don't know why. I can't explain why. I didn't keep a journal for several years. I had a teacher who sort of convinced me that the journal, I should just pour my energy into the poems and not keep a journal. So it was a practice I hadn't done for many years. So it could be that I was just reflexing on the mechanism of recording the daily thoughts. But those grief states, I'm sorry, I'm talking in circles. I think when I realized I was writing a book, what I had hoped to do was capture that early phase of grief, because I was so desperate to read things that would soothe me and that I could understand and experience. And there's really very few books that I've encountered that do that. I understand why, because when I read my journal, it's very incoherent and repetitive, and it isn't a story, right? But the good news of that is that I had like a lot of raw material to work from. I also see in retrospect, not to just focus on grief, but that these two processes, the journaling and the research. So, I didn't know I was constructing a narrative, but all of that work allowed me a lot of space to work through my grief, and in different ways. And for me, that was really, really important. This is like 10 years of grief work. That's what it was. So,
well, I'm going to put in the chat here again links to both books, and again, you can find all of those books on bookshop.org, or our favorite, if you happen to be in Orinda, California, Orinda Books, who is one of our biggest supporters and supporters of authors generally. We love Pat. We could go on and I'm going to probably push record off, and we can if you want, but I want to thank both of you, Tobey and Juliet, for writing, for your work that you've done, and for joining us today. I'd like to thank the audience and Orinda Community Church, who has been our gracious host since we began, and a complete partner in this process. And I want to thank all of you for coming. Keep writing. Remember, the story is flexible, and you have to find the right mode to find the truth too, I think. Keep reading too. Get your kids reading. We need good readers in order to survive this, whatever this is. Good night to you all. I'm going to press into the recording, but that's not the end of the night if you want to hang around. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you.